Thank you, Roberta. Hello again. So I'm going to switch my hats now. I've got too many of them. Should drop some of them. I'm going to take the hat of the chairman of the rulemaking group that developed a new rule for European provisions on AIS-AIM. That rulemaking group was made under the auspices of the EASA agency. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context about regulating AIS-AIM in a European context. So you may think we're in Rio, South America. Why would we care about this European regulation? The idea is to show you with this first part that what we had to deal with in Europe may to some extent be applicable in South America or in other parts of the world. Then I'll get into the details of this new rule and how it is different from our initial approach that some of you may be aware of with the term ADQ for actual data quality, and we'll try to put some conclusions as well. So the context, Europe, for those of you who don't know, we've got obviously a long history, and the geography of Europe, the countries, their extent, even their names have been moving over the past few centuries. I just heard during lunchtime that we've got a new name for one country as well in Europe right now. So it's a continuously evolving geographical and political situation in Europe. And in aviation, we're not different. In Europe, we've got many contexts. So we all have our good understanding of what a good regulation is. So country A will believe they need to make differences with Annex 15 on this and that provision. Country B will think the same, but with different provisions, etc., etc. So we all have either our own national European national AIM regulation, or we have our differences to the existing regulations. We all have good reasons as authorities or as providers. Yet, when it comes to the users that have to deal with not only one country but the whole of Europe, it becomes a nightmare for them because they've got to deal with a number of national text provisions, etc. That led a number of European agencies to try and come up with consistent regulation on AIS-AIM applicable to the whole Europe. Does that ring a bell? I believe in other countries there are also different countries. Countries with only one airdrome, one major airdrome, countries with a number of big airdromes because they have a wide geographical scope, and all of them belong to the same region. They may not have the same characteristics, but the provisions that are applicable to them have to cater for that diversity. So that's the challenge. I believe it is applicable elsewhere than Europe. So in terms of European regulation, we don't go from scratch. We, as I said at the beginning, we started this initiative of European AIS-AIM regulation with a text that was published in 2010 called ADQ, Actual Data Quality. That was our first attempt at this. I think the intent was good, the will to go there was good, but the devil was in the details. Maybe we wanted to make too big of a move at the first stage. Maybe we wanted to get too much into the technical details. So we did a regulation that was very extensive, very detailed, very technical, very prescriptive in some way, and we learned from the early days of implementation that we may have to rethink about this because, as we used to say, the best is often the enemy of the good. And I think that applies here. So what we want to do with the EASA regulation, deregulation, is what we call the better regulation. Better regulation meaning all that you see on the screen, catering for smooth implementation, being appropriate to the various situations, etc. The objectives is still to promote and to ensure that the quality of the data meets the user expectations and requirements. The difference between the previous regulation and the new draft one is that the previous one was only addressing the quality of data. There was no reference to the other provisions that you can find in Annex 15. With this new regulation, it's not only article data quality, it's also article information, products, and services. So in fact, it's aligned both with the ADQ or the spirit of ADQ and with the latest amendment of IQ Annex 15 and Tanzania. The constraints. Well, we'll try to highlight those constraints that are, in fact, lessons learned from our initial attempt with European regulation. So avoid to have unnecessary regulatory burdens. Make it simple. Well, that's the objective. Consultation will tell us whether we were successful in that. Anticipate the implementation challenges. So in other words, when we develop a provision, make a reality check whether it is realistic or not at all. And if it's not at all, maybe question the provision. Facilitate the rule transposition. Have a text that is easily transferable into national law. And of course, avoid duplication of rules, so try to make sure that one new rule will replace the other one rather than add to an existing one. So the challenges, when we started this, it was about 3 years ago, the AIS-AIM study group was up and running, but we didn't have all the results. So one thing that was really a challenge was this parallel development of ICAO provisions and the EASA rule. Hopefully we got a number of people involved in both activities who could make the bridge between those two initiatives. The other issue was that we had ADQ partly in force, and we knew the problems of compliance with ADQ. We know the implementation level was low, and we had to dig a little bit further to understand the rationale to try not to come up with the same result with the new rule. We also had a difficulty when we looked at the details of data quality requirements, because we had the ones of Annex 15, but they didn't necessarily match with the ones in other annexes. Hopefully there was an initiative with ICAO that we will be briefed about just after this presentation called the Data Catalog that helped us resolve this issue. So these are about the challenges that we had. In terms of the scope of the rules in the EASA setting, this is the usual data chain, from originators to provision to AIS, to those that process the data providers, to the users. So in the EASA setting, there's a rule for data providers. There's already an opinion by EASA, which is a kind of final draft rule to be formally stamped on this. We developed in parallel this data providers regulation that encompasses both the origination and the AIS. That was not an easy task because initially it was supposed to be AIS providers only. But in the rulemaking group, all the experts involved made a very strong case for saying it does not make sense to regulate AIS without addressing data originators. And if you retain only a couple of messages from this presentation, please do keep this one in mind. because, as you know, garbage in, garbage out. We can do best work ever in AIS. If the data is poor when transmitted to you, it's going to remain poor. So the regulation has to address both at the same time. It is an additional challenge, but it's worth it. So in terms of methodology and deliverables, well, methodology, as I said, we started from ICAO material and the existing rule, the ADQ, or which is also known as Regulation 73/2010. We focused on data quality, even if we also addressed the AISL provisions of ICAO Annex 15. And we tried to keep the better regulation model in mind. So in other words, make sure it is pragmatic, make sure it is realistic, and consider the implementation burden when drafting the rule to have a balanced rule. The deliverable, well, that's within the EASA setting. It follows a certain principle, so it's set according to what are called organizational requirements and technical requirements. I'll get back to this later. And we also developed, in parallel to the rules, some acceptable means of compliance, or AMC, and guidance material. So the rule tells you what you have to do. The acceptable means of compliance gives you a practical way to comply with what you have to do, and the guidance material will support with additional considerations that you can take for implementing your provisions. In terms of inputs, so we got the EASA existing regulation, or the basic regulation. We also got the ICAO Annex 15, Annex 4, also Van Zane, and we got the ADQ, and all of these inputs were used to build the EASA rules on AIA. So how did we overcome the main challenges? So the first one was this ICAO Annex 15 development in parallel. So we decided to run in parallel. That meant we had to adjust a number of times our rule. The good thing is it was a win-win situation because we challenged the draft ICAO material, which turned to provide some feedback to ICAO study group, which then turned to fine-tune the provisions and take again into consideration into the EASA. So I think it was a consolidation, a cross-check consolidation of both initiatives. The second main issue that we get to deal with is that technically EASA, which is a European agency for the safety of aviation, cannot put requirements on parties outside of the aviation community, like the surveyors. So we got to find a tweak to address them as well, because they are part of the originators. And the tweak we found was to use what we call the aviation undertakings. These are non-aviation parties, so we are not talking about airdromes or ANSPs or ACCs, etc. We are talking about some surveyors, National Geographic Institute, etc. And they have to comply with data quality requirements, and we put the burden to ensure so to the competent authority. By competent authority, most of the countries will understand states or national supervision authorities. So in terms of the other part, the work of ICAO, so I'm gonna maybe repeat with all the words what Roberta already described in the evolution of Annex 15. So basically, we've got our Annex 15 and the manual on AIS right now. We've got a new Annex 15 and still a manual on AIS. And we've got the new kid on the block, the Van Zane. So how we build that is we took those state provisions, or the WATs, and we put that into the annex. The operational provisions were put into the PANS, and the guidance was put into, or remains in the manual. And that corresponds to the kind of classification by IESA of organizational requirements that correspond to the what, technical requirements that correspond to the how, and acceptable means of compliance and guidance material that corresponds to these explanatory and guidance text. So I'm going to reuse a presentation that was given last year on the main changes from the existing Annex 15 to the new one, just to highlight some of the key points we took on board with this new IESA regulation. The split between data collection and data provision, that we took in the structure of the rule. The fact that we've got some new data services, like the provision of article data set, instrument file processing data set, all of this has been taken into consideration in the IESA rule. I skipped these other provisions to get back to the terms that we align. So we are 100% aligned with the new Annex 15 terms. Another interesting example, the data protection. We used to have CRC 32Q, which was very precise and technical in one way to meet a performance goal. And both ICAO and IESA wanted to change this to have a more performance-based approach. So we took this example again to illustrate our approach. The split between the paper and electronic has been done in the structure of Annex 15 and PANSE is also retained for the IESA maturity. The data catalog, so Rudy will talk about it next thing, but clearly we took this as our basis, and instead of having the data quality requirements in specific tables, we reused the ICAO data catalog as an appendix to the IESA rule. So the rule itself, well, that's internal European IESA cooking, but just for your information, this is the structure of the rule. You don't have to remember this. The only interesting point in this is that IESA is a kind of all-inclusive regulation. So it includes regulation for ATM providers, for airdrops, for AIS, for MET, for data providers. And when doing the AIS-AIM part, there were ripple effects on all the parts of the rule, like the airdrop rules, like what is applicable to the originators. So we had to address both the cover regulation, also have specific arrangements for this competent authority to deal with non-navigation parties, make sure we have the provisions about origination that apply to the airdrop and to the ATM AMS, and then have the specific part on the AIS. So it may sound a little bit complicated, but that's what it took us to make the link between this part and the other parts of the rule. So in terms of the AIS-AIM part itself, this is the structure we came up with. I'm not going to detail this. I'm just going to highlight that if you look into it, that looks like a lot what was presented by Roberta before, because that is aligned with the structure of Annex 15 and PANSE. And we took basically the same structure. So we've got our general requirements, everything related to data quality, and then we've got a whole section about the products, and then we've got the services, the updates, and the personal requirements. So that's it for the structure itself. More importantly, when we look at the evolution between our previous attempt with the European AIS-AIM regulation and the new one, I highlighted here some differences, but I should highlight first that we still have the same basic objective, ensuring the quality of data, ensuring consistency in the way AIS-AIM provisions are applied within Europe. Now, again, we build from the experience and we try to get a more performance-based approach. We tried to avoid putting some specific means to comply with a rule like the CRC 32Q, like a specific version of an exchange model, and we try to be more generic with that. We use the data catalog instead of specific data quality requirements. We also considered to have proportionality. So the way you apply the rule, depending on the fact that you're a major airport with millions of pax per year, or a small airfield may be different, and we try to cater for those differences as well. About acceptable means of compliance and guidance material, we learned from experience again of the previous ADQ that it was key to come up not only with a rule, but to come up with a rule and some practical means to implement the rule. So we made all efforts possible to come up with acceptable means of compliance in addition to the main provisions of the rule. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We used what was in existence in a number of supporting material, a number of existing practices, and we tried to sum them up. For the guidance, again, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We used some existing material, industry standards, Eurocai standards, ICAO material, ISO references, etc. And we either ordered them as a whole, because the whole document is a guidance, or we selected specific applicable provisions. So, at the end of the day, we believe, at least we being the ones who were active in developing this rule, we believe that we have a better approach to regulation. Because instead of technical details, we try not to go beyond a performance-based approach and keep the technical details for guidance or means of compliance. We also try to minimize the economic impact on the various stakeholders. For that, I'll give you an example. In our previous approach, we got some provisions about tool qualification or verification and validation processes that had to be applied by all stakeholders, especially originators. We realized in implementation that tool qualification comes with a cost. And if you apply this provision to all the surveyors, the airframes, etc., that doesn't work because they cannot stand this. So we decided that for this part, it is up to the originators, a performance-based approach. So you shall meet a data quality level. How you meet that? With automation, with tool qualification, or with other means, with double manual verification, etc. It's up to you. So it's a performance-based approach. The AMC, the acceptable means of compliance, may be that you qualify the tool you're using. So we made this split between the objective and the possible ways to meet the objective. We try to have a rule that is easier to understand and to implement with less cross-references. Also, I mentioned this proportionality, make sure that you can adapt some provisions depending on the size of the stakeholder and try to have objective and balanced rule ultimately. So all of this is now public. It's been public for 2 weeks. It's a public consultation, so it means if you Google EASA, AIS-AIM, you will get to what is called the NPA, Notice of Proposed Amendment 2016-02. It's open for public comments until the end of August. And following the comment period, there will be a review of the comments, there will be a response to all comments received, and there will be what we call an EASA opinion, which is the final text, final draft of the EASA submitted to the European Commission for final approval. So, again, to conclude this presentation, we now have only a green area for all Europe and potentially one European AIM rules. And we believe that compared with the nightmare it is to deal with 40 plus national regulation and having our users really in a difficult situation, we will have happy users with a new regulation. Thank you very much for your attention.